Most would agree that behind every folktale there is a history, but then with every historical event there is either a folktale or there's one in the making. That at least is how I see it. Today is July 4th, 2019. This is the 243rd anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, where we officially severed relations with the British Empire after we had already been fighting with them for over a year. We honor our forefathers, the people who made all of this possible: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, James Madison. All of them were taking part in this, and they are all held in special reverence today by Americans. We learn great things about them. And of course, as time goes on, we also hear a lot of stories about them that we just don't know if they're true or not. And then there are other stories about them that crop up after they had died, when people swear that they have encountered these people after they have died. And I love going into those particular stories as well. One of the things I want to talk to you today about is one of those stories about George Washington and about his presence in Mount Vernon even today after he had died many years ago. He died in 1799. To begin with here, I will start by saying the following. In 1776, Thomas Jefferson wrote our Declaration of Independence, and in the second paragraph, there are the most famous words in that document. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to effect their safety and happiness. This was the mentality that these people had with the signing of this document. There, of course, were arguments about what exactly it should say, but the final form had that in it. A lot of people like to point out or emphasize the existence of the term creator in this document. There are a lot of people who say, well, these people were trying to do a secular government because they didn't want religion getting involved, as is shown in the Constitution. But you do also have to realize that, okay, they didn't want church to get in there and start running things, or they didn't want the Church of England to be running our lives. But that does not mean that the people themselves were not religious at all. One of the things that George Washington wrote in his last years in his journal is that in his reflection back upon the American Revolution and its success, he attributed a lot of it to divine providence. This is what he wrote in his journal. I am sure there never was a people who had more reason to acknowledge a divine interposition in their affairs than those of the United States, and I should be pained to believe that they have forgotten that agency which was so often manifest during our revolution, or that they failed to consider the omnipotence of that God who alone is able to protect them. So these people were not atheists. They did acknowledge providence, divine providence, and divine intervention. But don't forget that their ancestors had moved into the Americas to get away from religious persecution by a theocratic state there in the British Isles. Today, we do seem to have a lot of talk about separation of church and state and how this thing means this and we shouldn't have religion in this and we need to remove this cross or whatever because it's on public land and government's not supposed to be affiliated with religion. And let's just say that these are a kind of clash of traditions that are rising up here in the Americas, and it'll be interesting to see where that goes. If George Washington is right, what will divine providence do next? Today, you may be out there lighting off your fireworks and seeing how much you can light up the night sky. You can launch your rockets, big exploding rockets. They're always the greatest things in the world. You can't have enough fireworks when it comes to the 4th of July. Whenever I go to places to celebrate the 4th of July in Utah, there are always neighbors who are setting them off all over the place. There used to be a spot where I could stand where I can actually look out over the Salt Lake Valley and see fireworks going off all over the place. But sadly, there have been some houses built there that block my view, so I can't really see many fireworks there. But in the neighborhood, I have little doubt that they will be setting off a lot of fireworks like they do every year. Now, getting away from fireworks, I want to take this into a direction that I tend to always like to take things when I am looking into really old or things of really old origin. And of course, that is the stories about our founding fathers. And there are some ghost stories associated with them. There is one about George Washington's ghost that I will be reading to you momentarily. But I'd like to ask you first, has everyone there heard the story about George Washington chopping down his father's favorite cherry tree? How, because he was honest with his dad and said, "Yes, father, I did chop down that tree," George Washington was given a great reward because of his honesty and integrity. And there have been some interesting things that people have done with that. Interestingly enough, Sesame Street actually created a little skit where they have Kermit the Frog interviewing George Washington's dad. And he stands there and his father says, "Yes, I am so proud that he is honest with me and telling me about all these things that he has done. He'll be a great man someday." And then the next thing you know, you see him going there with his axe and he's chopping down another cherry tree. He goes up and tells his dad, "I can't tell a lie, just chopped down another cherry tree." And his father's saying, "Well, okay." And then he goes back and he chops down another tree. And then he finally says, "Oh, for gosh sake, George, stop." So finally, George had chopped down too many cherry trees in his dad's orchard or vineyard, whatever you want to call it, in his dad's orchard. And so it's just interesting kind of what people do with the stories that come down to us. Some people might think, oh, that was an actual event that happened, but actually, that is a made up story. That is a folk tale that, as far as we know, has no basis in fact. But it is always a great story to tell people to help them to be honest in the future and to know that you will be respected if you tell the truth, even if you suffer the consequences afterwards. And a lot of us, of course, hold to that. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to read you a story. Mount Vernon is the home of George Washington. That's where he lived, and that's where he died in 1799. And Mount Vernon is a place where a lot of tourists like to go and visit. And like all really old buildings, there are stories about this particular house, this home being haunted. And it's haunted with George Washington's ghost. There are several places, actually, that are said to be haunted by George Washington's ghost. One could argue, dang, George Washington's ghost is a pretty active ghost since he's in a lot of places. But that just tends to happen with any famous ghost when it goes around. But of course, Mount Vernon is a very logical place for George Washington's ghost to be. And this is an account that was given by someone who had stayed in this particular house one night. A lot of people, it sounds like, are really brave and they want to experience and brave the terror that goes with being in the place where someone died because, they hear about ghost stories going in there and they think it's nonsense and then they go in and then they come out total believers. At least that's what happens in a lot of stories. So this is the account that I came across with one of the people who had stayed at the house. So since George Washington's death in 1799, there have been stories of mysterious activities and spectral sightings at Mount Vernon. Some are so old that they too are historic. This historic chamber is haunted. Of that there would seem little doubt. Many people within recent years have slept in it, and they declared that they were awed by the viewless presence of the nation's first president. They deny earnestly that the notion is based on the imagination. Few of these temporary occupants have been able to get any sleep. Obviously, it is one thing to see a ghost, and quite another thing to feel one, to be aware of the nearness of the strange and brooding specter. They all agree that Washington visits his chamber in the still watches of the night. So they do not see it, but they do feel it. A lot of people who have those experiences seem to be more creeped out at the notion of feeling it rather than just seeing it. Because if you see something, you can just kind of attribute it to, well, maybe I'm just imagining things and it's gone. But no, if you feel the ghost there, you feel you're not alone, then that is kind of a scary idea. Even if you think that that ghost means you no harm, you still don't like the idea of that ghost being there. And there are events such as actual battles, ghostly battles taking place on battlefields within the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, but I'll stick with the Revolutionary War. If you are to go to Valley Forge, some people have said that they have seen a ghostly army there at night camped out in preparation for crossing over into New Jersey and other places where Washington went after he had wintered there in the valley. There's a lot of people who died in Valley Forge during that horrible winter, and their ghosts are said to be seen all over the place with horrible disfigurement. Many of these people died terrible freezing deaths because they were not able to be dressed warmly and everything. There is also at Trenton, there's said to be ghosts in that area as well. When George Washington was crossing over between New York and New Jersey, or in the places where Washington crossed the Delaware on Christmas Day in order to surprise the British who were camped there. The famous crossing of the Delaware, surprising the British, they captured all of those soldiers that the British had there. And that, of course, revived the fighting spirit of the revolutionaries to continue on for the next several years, because up until that point, a lot of the spirit of the colonial fighters was disappearing because of all of the disasters that were happening up to that point. Another thing that has been immortalized and brought down to us from history is the image of George Washington down on his knees praying to God to help his army through the horrible winter there in Valley Forge. What I'm told, there is no confirmation or refutation, I suppose, either that actually happened, that George Washington was on his knees and praying for his army. But to be honest, to the folklorist, the facts aren't as important as having a good grasp of what people understand and having a good grasp of the folk tradition, the folklore, and the ideas that people got out of the American Revolution. Some of these stories, these little side stories that we hear about the American Revolution, originated maybe 50 years to 100 years after the end of the American Revolution. Sometimes I do like to go back and see if I can find the origin of a story, and it is not always easy to do that because for the longest time, this is just passed on by word of mouth, just like any folktale tended to be back in them old days before we started writing things down and had computers to keep them all in. I thank you so much for listening to this podcast on the American Revolution. My name is Richard Arlen Blake, and I do hope that you will listen in on my podcasts on Balladish Folklore Now, which will also be with this particular podcast, and listen to it, and feel free to let me know if anything that you find interesting that you would like to hear. My email address is folklorenow33@gmail.com. Have a wonderful day. Hope that your Independence Day was as exciting as mine was. And until next time, I bid thee adieu.